Any good stories of creepy encounters, scary experiences and unexplainable experiences in woods/forests? My mom used to tell me a story when I was younger, from when she was growing up in Massachusetts. She grew up outside Boston in suburban MA in the 60s and 70s, and there were plenty of areas closer to town that weren't as developed as today. The event in question, she was a teenager 13 to 14 years old, and like most teenagers of the time, one of the big things to do was walk down power lines and have parties or just hang out in the woods. So one evening it's just her and a female friend, and her friend's dog. He's a small terrier type of dog, kinda barky and energetic most of the time. They're hanging out by some power lines for a few hours, eventually a few more people show up and my mom and her friend want to head off somewhere else to talk by themselves and smoke a joint. So they find a trail and head off a few hundred yards into the woods. It was late summer and from what she said up in MA it would still be light out until like 9 to 10 p.m. They talked for a while, and by this point it's a little after 11 p.m. Time to head back before their parents got real worried, you know? As they're heading back, her friend's dog gets quiet and stops sniffing around and exploring like he usually did. And as they're walking he starts hanging real close to them, only straying a couple feet away at most. They're feeling uneasy and end up looking around to see if there's some sort of coyote or something nearby stalking them. But the trail was dark and they only had a cheap flashlight. They get back to the power lines and everyone is already gone. No reason to hang around, so they start down the trail through more woods back to their neighborhood. There was more light here, as she said there was moonlight and it was an open field kind of area. A little ways down the trail, her friend's dog stops and won't move, just sits there whimpering. That's when my mom said she first saw it. They look back and by the brightness of the open field they see something huge blocking the trail between them and the field. Couldn't really see features as the side facing them was in shadow, but at this point they don't care what it is. By the dog's reaction it's time to GTFO. Her friend picked up her dog and they ran as fast as they could down the trail back to their neighborhood. My mom said she could hear it running down the trail after them. It was only a couple hundred feet and the trail came out at the end of a cul-de-sac on an undeveloped street in the neighborhood. They didn't stop until they were a bit down the street, at which point my mom looked back and saw it standing in the cul-de-sac lit up by a streetlight. She swore it was much larger than any man she had seen, probably 7'8" tall and covered with brown hair. Up until now she and her friend thought it had been a creepy dude following them. Seeing this, she said her stomach dropped and her hair stood up on the back of her neck, an incredible feeling of dread. They took off running and didn't stop until they got to her friend's house a few streets over, but said they didn't hear it following. She said they didn't go back there for months afterwards. And when they did it was only for large parties. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the woods on the far side of the power lines. This is a true story that contains an old wives' tale from my gran, so it is exactly what it sounds like, and the truth of its accuracy is subjective to what the reader believes. The parts about my mom, Elle, and I are 100% true. We were about 8 or 9 the day Mom took Elle and I over the heath. It was a hot and bright day in the middle of the summer holidays. We had been collecting natural materials to make a collage when we got home, and Mom's rucksack was full of stray feathers, wild grasses, leaves and twigs, and we were on our way home where Gran was making a cheese flan and salad for dinner. As we were all very hot and slightly tired, Mom had decided that we would wade through the river instead of going back over the hills the way we had come. The thought of pushing my tiny wheelchair through the muddy-bottomed, weed-tangled river never seemed to faze my mom. She was a healthy, fit 26-year-old and knew the heath like the back of her hand. The river wasn't very deep at that part, so Mom tipped my wheelchair back, told Elle to hold on to the handle, and we went in. The water immediately soaked our clothes, threw in Elle and I started to scream, giggle and splash each other in sheer delight. Then we saw them. Weeds? Flowing with the current of the river, swaying back and forth like a woman's long tangled, unkempt hair, and I got the distinct impression that what we saw could have been either thing. I glanced at Elle and instantly knew that she was having the same uncanny notion. The weeds started to curl around our legs and the wheels of my wheelchair, making our progress a little more laborious, and our previous screams of playful fun changed to moans and squeals of unease and disgust as we felt the weeds gently tugging at our legs. At no point did Mom ever look anxious or fazed by this experience. She just kept saying, "It's only water weeds, you two. Come on, don't be silly, you've seen them loads of times." We finally reached the other side of the river, and as Mom dragged my wheelchair backwards up the riverbank, Elle climbed up it and sat down beside me. We both just stared silently at the river and the sea of green for what felt like the longest time, but in actual fact, was only 10 minutes, before walking the rest of the way home. That night, after a hot bubble bath and cheese flan salad, in our flannel pajamas and slipper socks around the fire drinking hot tea, we told Gran about our adventure. Our Gran took a sip of tea from her mug and told us the story of Green Hair. She had been a real person, though her real name had been forgotten by Gran, conveniently, Elle and I thought. Anyway, she had lived in the village around 1912, before the area was built up and modernized and developed into what it has become. She was young and kind, with a pretty face and beautiful long blonde hair, a daughter of a gentleman farmer, and was deeply in love with a handsome, young soldier. They were to get married, but before they could, the Great War broke out and her young man was called up to fight. He was killed by a hand grenade on the front line, and when she found out she was widowed before she'd even become a wife, she lost the will to live, and driven by grief-stricken insanity she went to the same river that we waded through, and she threw herself in. The river was as wild as the land at that time, and by the time her body was discovered, it was blue, bloated, and half-eaten by fish. Her long corn-colored hair had become interwoven with the slimy algae and long strands of evil-smelling river weeds which clogged and choked the bed of the river. In fact, the pathologist who performed the post-mortem said that the body may have been found sooner if not for the dark green weeds that appeared to have curled around her limbs and torso, anchoring her corpse to the riverbed for days. From that time onwards, it was said that that river was haunted, cursed, or both, anyway an extremely bad place. People claimed to see the spirit of the young woman kneeling beside the river and weeping bitterly. More commonly, people often saw the body of the girl floating on top of the water, with long green hair/weeds streaming out behind her, and so she was given the name of Green Hair. Elle and I asked Gran why we hadn't heard this story before. Gran just smiled and said because it was an age ago, even before she, herself was born, and moved to the area. The area was developed and built up and the river was tidied up and reconstructed, and along with it the tragic tale of Green Hair was lost in the stream of passing time. We didn't altogether believe Gran's morbid tale, but when Elle and I talked about it in bed that night, neither of us could dismiss the eerie feeling that we saw green hair flowing in the river that day.